Wednesday, 30 AD, 2 days before his death. Recap. Jesus and his disciples returned to Lazarus' home on Tuesday night after a very long day of ministry. Now, as you recall from our lesson yesterday, Jesus and his disciples awoke early and they walked the 45-minute walk back and forth to Jerusalem. Now, along the way, we talked about the fact that he cursed a fig tree. He visited a fruitless temple. He cleansed it and personally healed scores of people who were lame and sick and infirm. After this, a kind of worship service broke out in the temple complex, and Jesus had a brief interaction with the Pharisees before leaving and walking back to the town called Bethany, Mark 11:19. So you can imagine after that 45-minute walk, everyone must have been exhausted. But this didn't stop him from waking up early again the next morning and heading right back to the city for more confrontations and a kind of showdown with the Jews. Now, before arriving again in the city, the group passed by the fig tree that Jesus had cursed the day before, on Tuesday, Mark 11:20. Peter apparently took notice of the shriveled tree, and he stopped the group for a moment of discussion. This occasion gave Jesus one of the final opportunities that he had to teach his disciples, this time instructing them on faith and prayer and forgiveness, Mark 11:22-26. But he was far from finished with teaching for the day. As they made their way into the city once more and then again to the Temple Mount, which Mark records for us in chapter 11:27, his teaching on various topics had just begun. And he enters into a sort of quid pro quo situation with the Pharisees. At the temple, Mark tells us that Jesus was confounded by the angry religious mobs who had been planning his demise from the night before. Their charge against him was leveled in a series of carefully worded accusations disguised as questions. They began saying things like, "By whose authority are you doing these things?" Now, Jesus had a very important decision that he needed to make that would affect everything, especially the timing of his death. He could tell them directly that God had already condemned them, giving the kingdom over to the tax collectors and sinners, Matthew 21:32-43. But that would have gotten him arrested and killed on Wednesday instead of on Passover. He could have ignored the question and he could have went on about his business, trying his best not to pay attention. But given the volatility of the situation and the anger and intensity of the religious mob, doing that would have probably inflamed their anger even more. So this didn't seem like a viable option either. So instead, Jesus wisely leveraged the fact that the onlooking crowds were standing nearby, watching with rapt attentiveness. And Jesus knew that the Pharisees would never act in such a way that would turn the crowds against him. They cared too much about their opinion and having notoriety and fame. They may have wanted Jesus dead, but they would not crush their lust for power and popularity among the masses. Before answering their question directly, Jesus gave them a quid pro quo scenario. He offered them the following deal. He said, "If you will answer my question, then I will answer yours," which seemed straightforward enough, but by turning the tables and having them answer his question, he was actually showing them who had the real authority and who didn't. Jesus asked them, "Was the baptism of John the Baptist from heaven or from men? Answer me this." Jesus knew that if they denied the baptism of John, then they would lose their stranglehold on the people who loved John and considered him a prophet. But if they affirmed John, then they would look utterly foolish for wanting to kill Jesus, Mark 11:32. In this brilliant rhetorical move, Jesus put the Jewish leaders in an impossible situation that would turn the crowds against them regardless of how they answered. In the end, he not only avoided their trap, but he sprung one on them as well and humiliated them in their own non-answering posture. And by doing that, he delayed his own death. Once more, safe, guarding his demise until just the right time of Passover week. Now, Jesus capitalizes on this moment, given that the Jewish leaders were kind of bound to begrudging public civility since they could not kill Jesus in front of the masses or the crowds would turn on them. So Jesus took this moment to offer his strongest public rebuke of the Pharisees to date, offering two scathing parables that you can read for yourself in the following passage. The parable of the two sons in Matthew 21:28 through 32, and the parable of the vineyard, Matthew 21:33 through 44. The point of both of these parables was the same. The Jewish leaders were being removed from their authority. They were being punished by God for their lack of repentance. God had sent his one and only Son to them, and in the hardness of their hearts and the stiffness of their necks, they were going to kill him. They were going to kill God's Son. But in killing him, he would become the new foundation, a new cornerstone on which men and women all over earth would be built up in the faith on him. No longer would they need the priest and their law books and the Pharisees and their heavy burdens that they placed on people, or even the sacrificial system for that matter, which was not sufficient to save anyone. Now they would need only Jesus Christ, who would save them from their sins and who would make them fruitful again in his presence. Unlike the tree that Jesus cursed, Christ would make his people fruitful once again. Now, Jesus settled the question of authority right before their eyes, but in the wicked hearts of the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees, the matter was far from settled. The leadership, after the scathing rebuke, regrouped. There had never been a time when the Jewish leaders had been so thoroughly challenged, and yet there had also never been a time where they were so thoroughly incapable of responding. Out of fear of the crowds, they retreated for a moment, Matthew 21:46, but they were far from finished challenging him. Tomorrow, we're going to see in part 2 of this confrontation. We're also going to see Jesus' vivid prophecy of Jerusalem's destruction, along with the late-night preparations for the Last Supper that Jesus and his disciples prepared. Join us tomorrow as we continue our series on the last days of Jesus. God bless.